for that, Ollie. So I want to welcome everyone to our Global Gothic seminar. Just to reiterate, questions are at the very end of the speakers, and please put your information in the chat and address which speaker your question is for. And also just a reminder that this is going to be recorded. So first up, we have Leonie Rowland, who is a PhD student with the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies at Manchester Metropolitan University, where she has completed her MA. She's researching commodity animism in Japanese Gothic. Leonie is Assistant Reviews Editor with the British Society for Literature and Science and Editor-in-Chief of the Hungry Ghost Project. Her academic work has been published in Japanese Horror Culture, New Critical Approaches, Fantastica Journal, and the Dark Arts Journal. Her debut collection of prose is available from Drake. So, without further ado, she will be presenting a paper called Brand Name People, Commodity Animism in Gothic Japan, Post-War to Present Day.
Thank you so much, Ali. Before I start, can I just double check? I've written a 30-minute paper. Do you want me to sort of lop off the end so that it's 20 minutes?
Yeah, I'll see how it goes. Because
okay.
You might, your timing will be off, so it's fine.
Fantastic. It's in 3 sections, so it's quite easy to do.
Perfect.
Grand. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm just going to share my screen with you so you can see my PowerPoint. Can you see that? Anyone? Yeah, fantastic. Okay. So my PhD project is titled Brand Name People, Commodity Animism in Gothic Japan. And I've been working on this project with the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies for about 3 months. So I started in October. So today I'm presenting the preliminary research for the project. Any interactions would be much appreciated at this stage. And I hope you enjoy. In her sociological study, Cuties in Japan, Sharon Kinsella identifies the dominant themes of kawaii, or Japanese cute culture, as cuteness, nostalgia, foreignness, romance, fantasy, and science fiction. However, she fails to mention one of its more prominent, if unexpected, modes of expression, the Gothic. With this in mind, my project contests the post-war success story of Japanese capitalism at the level of lived experience, tracking the manipulation and exploitation of consumers through the sale of cute commodities imbued with the illusion of life. In doing so, it accounts for the eruption of animated objects in the post-war Japanese Gothic, in which people are frequently terrorized by their possessions and occasionally date them. This signals a complex interplay of horror and reverence towards a capitalist system that makes people lonely and then sells them the illusion of companionship through cunningly Shintoesque marketing techniques. The term commodity animism refers to the symbolic animation of the material world in a commercial context. Objects, such as washing machines and microwaves, are infused with the illusion of a life to target lonely demographics, who consume the idea of companionship through ownership of these goods. According to Anne Allison, this leads to animated commodities becoming the conduit for various forms of communication, intimate relationships, and arousals, compensating for the breakdown of human relations caused by capitalism by offering commercially available alternatives. In Gothic texts, the dead are reanimated to similarly insubstantial ends, making commodity animism a Gothic phenomenon in its marriage of the living to the alluringly, dangerously not. Consequently, neoliberal Japan is often discussed in Gothic terms, with Charles Shiro Inouye stating that reverence for the inanimate makes the country profoundly Gothic. By this, He means that tropes typically associated with the Gothic are already embedded in Japanese culture, where monsters are ubiquitous, the barrier between the living and the dead is porous, the sacred is readily available, and the repulsive is often playfully received. More specifically, my project argues that the Gothic is embedded in Japan's consumer culture, which vocalizes and capitalizes on the frustrations of life in the global economy through the eruption of transgressive human-object relations known as commodity animism. As the name suggests, this marketing technique has roots in animism, the Shintoist belief that every component of the natural world is inhabited by a spirit. Shinto is the indigenous faith in Japan, and its continued presence in contemporary life makes Japanese consumers particularly receptive to commodity animism. As Russell Belk notes, belief in the life force of objects has been cited as one reason why the Japanese are more apt to embrace robots, while Westerners are more apt to fear them. However, whereas animism is usually associated with reverence for the natural world, the allocation of conscious life to commodities relocates the sacred spaces of Shinto to supermarkets and shopping malls. By repurposing the language of human intimacy, these products offer a carefully constructed alternative to a lifetime of loneliness, reinforcing conservative narratives by locating the solution to problems caused by the capitalist system within the system itself. Cunningly, then, commodity animism maps spiritual practice onto the commercial realm, co-opting its internal logic of reverence towards the natural world to generate profit. Anxiety surrounding social isolation has been especially prevalent in Japan over the last 3 decades. The aptly named Japan's Old Men Are the World's Loneliest, written by Junko Okamoto, calls Japan the loneliness superpower, using language associated with the nation's economic ambitions to emphasize the duality of its much coveted world influence. Loneliness, Okamoto implies, not only results from Japan's economic power, but surpasses it in the global consciousness. The COVID-19 era in particular has seen unprecedented levels of isolation, with weddings and vigils taking place on the Nintendo game Animal Crossing, and virtual pets making people happier and more productive during lockdown. Thus, in a culture where kodokoshi, meaning lonely death, and karoshi, meaning death by overwork, are interlacing terms, commodity animism is sinister because it fosters emotional dependence on something with no emotional capacity, prioritizing the generation and exchange of capital over connection. By fulfilling the desire for companionship through illusionary means, consumers become content in their isolation and therefore less likely to take steps towards genuine change on personal and systemic levels. As Baudrillard writes, what adapts to you is an imaginary agency, in this case, the illusion of companionship, whereas you are asked in exchange to adapt to an agency that is distinctly real, the exchange of capital. No matter how much we pay for them, our toasters, unfortunately, cannot love us back. This exposes commodity animism as a distraction from a world in which corporate capitalism, the mundane, and a global pandemic, the catastrophic, require the same coping mechanisms. Commodity animism can be viewed under the banner of cute or kawaii capitalism, which is the construction and commodification of adorable personalities that are sold to conceal and compensate for the exploitative workings of the capitalist system. In Kanzawa's study, a member of the Japanese public defined kawaii as people who can't communicate. Simultaneously, another person defined it as when people make contact with someone else. In this way, Kawaii covers the full spectrum of human communication, making it the ultimate marketing agent. By collapsing the ability and the inability to communicate into one easily disseminated term, cute capitalism makes consumers feel transformed into someone who can communicate and understood as someone who can't. However, the act of making contact with someone else is also infantilized through this process, reducing it to something that does not or cannot occur in the adult world. This implies that human bonds should be possessed and cherished in the same way that one might cherish the little round, weeping, digitalized vacuum cleaners and rice cookers of commodity animism, making the connection dubiously human after all. For this reason, cute capitalism goes to extreme lengths to present its success on the global market as coincidental, since to reveal its true nature would be decidedly un-kawaii. To this end, a final participant in Kinzella's study defined kawaii as when without any connection to profit, the mood of your heart is expressed. Here, without any connection to profit means without any obvious connection. By placing connection to profit and the mood of your heart in close conjunction, the quotation undermines itself by defining cute in relation to the economic ambition it attempts to distance itself from. In this, it suggests that cute has been expressed so successfully on the global market that it has come to understand the human heart, or, more disturbingly, has redesigned it in its own image. The heart, after all, is the most kawaii of symbols, representing idealized love and gentle affection rather than the erratic palpitations of an overworked, overcaffeinated human organ. By this logic, the physical and emotional strain placed upon the human body by corporate capitalism is also concealed. By young women, surrounding themselves with heart-shaped goods, such as Mima does in Satoshi Kon's animated horror film Perfect Blue, and by the promise of heartfelt exchange, which, despite mediation through capital, produces the same sexual and sentimental responses as love. In this way, the market becomes the source of human feeling, manufacturing social conditions that conform to capitalist ideologies, and then selling goods that respond to the emotions produced by these conditions. This consolidates their validity as natural ways of being, since they appear to stem from ontological experience. So, the texts in question frame relationships between humans and objects as sources of transgression and horror, but they also present them as valid ways of coping with life under late capitalism, albeit temporarily. Thus, the fear they generate inverts the structure of deliverance that Inoue attributes to the Japanese Gothic. In each case, the neoliberal subject is delivered from oppressive social structures, making the necessary return to safety from their trespass in the territory of eros and death. However, this deliverance is, of course, a reaffirmation of the capitalist system, which benefits from the sale of products designed to make the lifestyle it demands more palatable. In this way, the texts engage in a complicated, nuanced fear that appears as both horror and reverence, since they acknowledge the comfort often found in material possessions, showing a kind of reverence for a capitalist system that has rewritten what it means to be connected. However, they ultimately reveal the destructiveness of this kind of connection, whilst also asserting that the characters' relationships with the objects they own are more intimate than their relationships with other people. Thus, whereas the Gothic monster is still a ready means of mobilizing all territory discourses, as my lovely supervisor Leonie has argued, the abject otherness of the vampire, the werewolf, and the zombie that typically characterizes the mode is here replaced by the propinquity of humans and everyday objects. In the second part of this talk, I'm going to give 2 examples of the way commodity animism manifests in the Japanese Gothic. Nobuhiko Obayashi's Hausu presents commodity animism in its most prominent form, repurposing the language of human intimacy to convey affection for inanimate objects during periods of loneliness. As such, it confronts the perils of trusting the material world, especially in its capacity to mimic human emotion. The film follows a group of schoolgirls as they journey to a remote mansion belonging to the estranged aunt of their classmate, who has apparently lived there since her husband died in the Pacific War. The aunt moves around the house with a sinister air, disappearing into fridges before methodically feeding each of the girls to her furniture. Clearly, she is not over her husband's death. Rather, the aunt's interactions with her possessions demonstrate dependence on the material world in the face of loss, the primary coping mechanism commodity animism seeks to instill. When one of the girls finds the aunt in her kitchen alone and asks who she is talking to, the aunt replies, "To my oven." To which another girl responds, "Of course she talks to her oven," framing this as an understandable response to solitude. The aunt goes on to explain that she has lived alone for so long that she talks to everything in her house, which both replaces her husband in its attempt to offer companionship and signifies his absence in its ultimate failure to do so. However, unlike commodity animism, which is always a one-way exchange, the relationship between house and aunt is at least partially reciprocal. She talks to the house, and by eating the people she feeds it, the house, in a sense, talks back. This reveals an interplay between person and possessions, where the house sustains the aunt by feeding off human energy, mirroring the kind of exchange that takes place in contemporary consumer culture, where people are drained of their financial resources, which are usually acquired through labor and therefore take a physical toll on the body, to power a hungry system. Your chest of drawers may not be eating you, but it is eating the thing you are measured by and that ultimately keeps you alive, your capital. This speaks to a longing for permanence that is left unchecked by the conditions of existential uncertainty, of rumbling instability, that Alison argues have led many Japanese people to feel that they don't belong anywhere in neoliberal times. To this end, Ruth Goldberg refers to classic Japanese horror films as meditations on impermanence and desire, gesturing to anxiety surrounding the transience of life, love, and national identity in the wake of World War II. Commodity animism removes impermanence from the equation by substituting a changeable human partner for an object that is seemingly fixed in its physicality and identity. It is possible, through a lifetime of care, to ensure your table does not grow old and die, but the same cannot be said for a person, no matter how much we love them. Likewise, unless you're living in the horrorscapes of Junji Ito, your house, unlike a human, does not have the capacity to leave you and have sex with someone else. This, however, does not account for the underlying impermanence of material reality, organic or not. Houses crumble and are reclaimed by governments. Toasters break and are replaced. And the illusion of permanence they offer is only accessible to those who can afford it and have time to maintain its shining exterior, both luxuries in the neoliberal age. As such, Izumi Satsuki's short story, That Old Seaside Club, from her collection Terminal Boredom, shows an underlying skepticism towards the material world. In the story, commodity animism does not just mimic the human capacity for emotional intelligence, but surpasses it when a woman is given frustratingly perceptive romantic advice by a chair that speaks like her mother. The narrator hates being alone with the chair, who only ever says mean things. Consequently, she is never sat on the chair, causing the object to transcend its original purpose. If the chair exists to give romantic advice rather than provide a resting place, its structure no longer makes sense, and its physicality reflects this. It strides about the room in a way that is logistically impossible, even under the assumption of life, since stride, in light of its trembling velvet cover and wobbling armrests, connotes disproportionately long legs. Thus, instead of presenting the chair as an object with renewed potential as it might be marketed under commodity animism, Suzuki asks when a chair stops being a chair, and perhaps more pressingly, what it becomes instead. The answer arrives when, following the latest bout of romantic advice, the narrator says, "The nerve of this chair," using a word like love, "has she no shame?" This draws associations between love and shame as they are experienced by humans, framing connection as an undignified force. But it also refers to the nerve of the chair specifically, which cannot traditionally experience love, let alone conceptualize it better than a person, and yet perceptively comments on human desire in a way that illuminates both object and human, the gulf between them being that the former can speak of love and the latter cannot. To this end, when the narrator and her partner discuss their relationship, they speak in questions, followed by the reduction of feeling to the decidedly unromantic touch of flesh. The chair, however, speaks in certainties, statements about the narrator's psyche, such as, "He could say it 100 times and you'd still never be satisfied," that can be generalized as assessments of the human condition. Perhaps, then, the question is not what the chair becomes, but what it means for humanity, which, in comparison, appears less than human. On the one hand, this affirms the belief that capitalism is looking after people by supplying material solutions to their inadequacies. On the other, it implies that these so-called solutions are themselves Gothic entities, born of a system that is at once excessive in its inescapable cycle of labour and consumption, and deficient in its attention to humanity's emotional needs. The result is a fear that manifests as a complex interplay of horror at capitalism's ability to cause problems and then sell solutions back to those who have been wronged, and reverence at the apparent validity of these solutions. In the face of this contradiction, commodity animism cunningly suggests that the real problem is people, their lack of care for each other, their adherence to regressive social structures, and their insatiable desire to consume. Ali, how am I doing for time? Am I okay for another 7 minutes or so, or would you rather that I wrapped up?
You're at 21 minutes, so if you could just
I'll wrap up, no problem.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, the prevalence of commodity animism in the Japanese Gothic demonstrates that in contemporary Japan, the market dictates not only what it means to be alive, but what it means to be human. To this end, Inouye argues that with animism at its heart, the post-human realm is a world in which human beings, machines, plants, and animals exist on the same non-hierarchical plane. He goes on to write that whether we call this plane one of animistic equanimity or a nightmarish fall from mortal power depends on our expectations of what the human were to begin with. Commodity animism complicates this view of post-humanism because it repositions animism as a product of consumer culture, an aggressively human force. As Suzuki demonstrates in That Old Seaside Club, this challenges conceptions of what it means to be a person under late capitalism, since traditional markers of humanity, such as the capacity to love, are simulated in market-orientated, non-human settings. However, by reorientating human sentiment towards the non-human world, commodity animism paradoxically reinforces anthropocentrism, despite the privileging of objects. Since the products of commodity animism are not actually alive, their apparent validity conceals the exploitative human processes necessary to their creation, such as the outsourcing of labor onto emerging economies and the exchange of money for illusions, both of which are obscured by the affirmation that the product has, and always will have, its own agency. Thus, it is the moment of animation, rather than the sustaining of it, that generates horror in these texts. By depicting objects that have overcome their own inanimacy, the Japanese Gothic reminds us that, in the real world, they have not. To this end, the illusion of equanimity proffered by commodity animism simulates humanity's fall from mortal power, but the nightmare is distinctly human. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonie, for that really good paper. And of course, although it's virtual, everyone give a virtual round of applause. So we're going to move on to Peter's paper. However, I just want to clarify, we're having some issues with the chat. Not everyone can see it or kind of type into it. So we're going to actually do a bit of a mix of, if you cannot do the chat, we're going to do raise hand function when we have questions. And Fred and I are going to be monitoring that. So please be patient while we deal with this like slight technical difficulty. So I'd like to introduce next Peter Ceccawanzo Ezeiyoke, another one of our PhD candidates. His research focuses on the impact of postcolonial theory and evolution of African speculative fiction. Parallel Universe publication published a collection of his short stories, Haunted Grave and Other Stories. His latest critical publication is Women of the Airplanes and the Prediction of the Future, exploring ways to conceptualize African literature beyond postcolonialism of writing back. And today, he will be presenting a paper titled Beyond Postcolonialism, Postcolonial Gothic in African Literature.
Is he sharing? Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to get off.
We can see you, but we can't see your screen.
All right. Share content. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
Oh, wait. Now we can, yes.
All right. So my paper is titled Beyond Postcolonial Gothic in African Literature. African literature, repeat, is doing well. So part of the field of African literary scholarship today. By contrast, and very gratefully, I will have to say that African literary criticism, that is, literary criticism carried out by scholars who identify themselves as specialists in African literary studies, is in an anemic state at the moment. Our current preoccupation as critics have not extended far beyond those that animated discussion from 1960 to the 1980s. I begin the presentation with a book quote from the 2014 presidential address by the late Professor Teomilo Olayina to the African Literature section. The quotation describes my motive for conceptualizing African beyond the post-colonial discourse that has dominated the field of African literature since the 1960s. Though the relationship between Afro-Gothic and post-colonial theory has been beneficial to an extent, it has been responsible for a too narrow focus and for loss of opportunity to gain a broader understanding of varied functions, affairs, and modes of African creative production. My research looked beyond the confines of postcolonialism, developing an alternative method for theorizing the diverse and rich culture being produced in the continent and by writers in African diaspora, which do not fit into a dominant postcolonial paradigm, which ensures a binary politics of representation vis-a-vis the colonized versus the colonizer. What I'll be doing with this time you afford me is to present to you of one of the methodologies I'm exploring, which can enable an engagement with African cultural production, which otherwise the over-reliance on the paradigm of postcolonialism will have eluded. I'm aware that Gothic theoretical paradigm is a Western concept. The first challenge is how appropriate it is to be used to analyze African literary production. Ubekado can expose this difficulty. Lucan argues that, for instance, that the magic intervention in African literature are not consonant with those in Gothic texts. The reason is because of what Garuba calls the animist unconsciousness, which organizes reality in culture with history of animist tradition. Literature under this tradition, for instance, the appearance of supernatural beings might not invoke fear on uncanny, which is the typical character of a Gothic text. Fear is the reason why Gothic is called the literature of terror. It is because of this that Lucan, quoting Copper, argues that there is no Gothic subtext undergrounding the magical ray, that is magical realism and animist text. However, Lucan further analysis by positing ways in which African literature can be classified as Gothic. For one thing, Lucan observed that there are some African texts that demand to be analyzed as Gothic texts by their very incarnation. Lucan's right. From the outset, it should be noted that to a certain extent, Gothic appears as an appropriate category for analyzing on the grounds that it is demanded by the text themselves. Here I am making reference specifically to Ono, who is heard on the jacket of an unhallowed grave as the forerunner of African horror. Lucan further argues that Gothic also, as Ono makes especially clear, currently is being actively invoked within African imagination. Further, Lucan includes the work of Setebe and Oyayemi as drawing from the similar tradition of Ono. Lucan argues that the work of these writers as Gothic are unified in ways they challenge gender oppression. Lucan therefore argues that African writers use the vertical structure of Gothic form as a means of interrogating gender configuration authority that have yet to be fully addressed. The tense Gothic relationship between the real and its submerged supernatural substrate becomes, in other words, the framework for excavating still obscure historical experiences. Thus, this point Lucan made is important for the reason I will undertake here. That is, my research following from Lucan's framework aims to interrogate the configuration of gendered authority using the submerged supernatural substrate in the three texts Things Fall Apart by Chuno and Chebe, Abiku, a poem by J.P. Clark, and Freshwater by Ekwoke Ameze, which I'll be reading to excavate still obscure historical experiences of gendered oppression, suppression. That is, this text becomes Gothic in as much as this supernatural substrate tells us about historical secret of gender repression and suppression. The supernatural substrate which the three texts built upon is which I'll be reading to reveal obscure historical expressions of gender suppression from Igbo and Yoruba cultures, from whose cosmology texts are written, is Ogbanje stroke Adiku. Ogbanje is an Igbo word, which is equivalent in Yoruba is Adiku. It is a spirit that is born to a human mother, a kind of a trickster that dies unexpectedly only to return in the next child and do it over again. J.P. Clark articulates this rebirth in a verse of a book, aiming to discourage the Ogbanje stroke Adiku for reincarnating again in his poem titled Adiku Toss. Coming and go these several seasons, do stay out in the Bible tree, follow where you please your kingdom spirit, if indoor is not enough for you. In the above text, Clark is offering an Adiku a permanent exit from living and to dwell perpetually with the spirit since the continual rebirth shows that the Abiku prefers the spirits to the living. It is because of this series of dying and rebirth that people fear having a child who is Abiku Sokobanje. It is fear that David Punta argues as what is the consistent signifier of a Gothic text and its imagination. This fear, which is a marker to Gothic incarnation, permits the relationship between an Ogbanje Abiku character and the society and the family, the Abiku or Ogbanje dwell. For instance, in Things Fall Apart by Chuno and Chebe, the character Ezima and Ogbanje in the relationship with her family and society shows that her family sees her as a thing of trauma and fear. The discussion between Ezima Mother Ekwefi and Chelo, the chief priestess of the village, in Anchebe's text testifies to this above claim. Yochi is very much awake, my friend. And how is my daughter Ezima? She has been very well for some time now. Perhaps she has come to stay. I think she has. How old is she now? She's about 10 years old. I think she will stay. They will stay if they do not die before the age of 6. I pray she stays, say Ekwefi with a heavy sigh. This discussion shows the constant fear the family of an Ogbanje is subjected to. There is a perpetual fear from the family of losing a loved one, Ondotu, who Ezima calls brother and sister. That is their otherworldly siblings. In the text, Achebe writes that Ekwefi has already lost 9 children due to this. That is that Ezima has been reborn 9 times already. Each death and death bring a trauma to her mother. So when Ezima was born, Ekwefi is said to first accepted her as she had accepted others with listless resignation. But even as her daughter grows and she did not die, Ekwefi cannot get herself lost totally that Ezima will stay. Such was her anxiety for her daughter that she could not ride herself completely of her fear. The fear is of that springs from the heart of constant pain and horror and that come from bereavement. The poem of J.P. Clark Abiku testifies to this pain and touch of endless birth and rebirth. Clark begging Abiku on behalf of the suffering mother rise. Then step in and stay, for her body is tired, her milk growing sour, where many mouths gladdens the heart. We see in this line pain and fear. This fear is because of an experience the Abiku Sokobanje mother endured. Apart from the emotional throe of witnessing one's child die, the mother likely will experience extreme tiredness and fatigue since the progesterone and oestrogen levels in the mother's body are high. It will take a time for these hormones in the body of a mother to try to rebalance. This is because the hormones in the mother's body is ready to breastfeed, but the child who's supposed to suckle the breast milk is dead. This will momentarily introduce crisis in the natural body's process of the mother. It becomes more traumatic for a mother to undergo such over and over again due to repeat life cycle of Ogbanje, which is precisely the situation where Ekwefi finds herself subjected to for 9 times. It is this fear of such a constant traumatizing loss that made the family, who suspect to have bettered an Ogbanje into engaging in different rituals to cut the bond between Ogbanje and the other world. In the Things Fall Apart, such ritual is executed in various ways. Ekwefi engaged in this ritual from the identity of the child. The text says, the birth of her children, which should be a mother crowning glory, because for Ekwefi made physical agony the vow of promise. Her deepening despair found expression in the name she gave her children. One of them was a pathetic cry, Onbiko, which death I implore you. But death took no notice. Onbiko died in the 15th month. The next child was a girl, Ozemena. May it not happen again. She died in her 11th month. Okonkwo, as a father, embarked in his own ritual to protect the Ogbanje. Okonkwo went to a medicine man who advised him that once his wife is pregnant, she should depart to her parents' house. In this way, she will elude her wicked tormentor and break the evil cycle of birth and rebirth. However, Onwubiko, who is born following the advice, died too. Okonkwo further consulted another medicine man, more specialized than the former, and after which Ezima was born. This curtailment imposed in Ogbanje is also manifest too in the tattoo that marks the parents of Ogbanje imposed on the diseased child as a discouragement and a pain to deter Ogbanje from reincarnating. Clark captured it thus. We know the knife scars serrating down your back and front like the beak of the swordfish, and both your ear notched as a bondsman to this house, all are relic of your first coming. The lines in the poems reflect the thought of visited on the body of the deceased Ogbanje. The marking is inscribed with a knife, and it was no adornment, but of a revenge and anger that the corpse is serrated down at the front and back. This torturous revenge becomes a way the family tries to exercise their fear by confronting the dead body of the Ogbanje by a greater violence and terror. However, that is a further reason why the parents of the Ogbanje mark the deceased child, which is not about punishment. It is that the parents need a symbol and sign to use to recognize the Ogbanje in the second coming, and that is why Clark, in a book quote, calls the mark a bondsman. That is the surety of identification. Since Ogbanje being a trickster is known for a gender swapping. It is because the gender of Ogbanje is non-binary. Is the reason why Mr. Blanc says Ogbanje is not gender in some everyday sense. Both male and female or children are said to be Ogbanje. If they are free, there will be parents and lineage by dying repeatedly. Because of this, that Blanc further posits that the sexual appearance of Ogbanje may indeed be seen as a charm. It is here that freshwater makes its point of entrance. The main protagonist in the novel is an Ogbanje. It is precisely because she's an Ogbanje is why her sexual identity in the text is non-binary. Freshwater is a fictionalized autobiography of the writer Ezeiyoke. The author, Ezeiyoke Emeze, just like the character Ada in the novel, clothed their sexual identity as non-binary because of being an Ogbanje. Emeze writes, the possibility that I was an Ogbanje occurred to me around the same time I realized that I was trans. But it took me a while to collide the two worlds. The Ogbanje even has a gender to begin with. Gender is, after all, such a human thing. It is in this realization that being an Ogbanje is implicated in being a trans that Ada in the freshwater, in novel freshwater, has found all the decisions she made. We can now return again to the character examination of Ezima and Chebet text and explore her sexual identity. In the text, Okonkwo has to remind Ezima that she should sit like a woman, because being a woman that behaves like a man, a butch, she sits like a man. She is a woman who behaves like a man, is why she wants to carry Okonkwo's school for him to the wrestling match. But again, Okonkwo refuses and reminds her that it is a man's duty in their culture. Elsewhere in the text, Okonkwo has wished that she were a boy. The father and daughter understand themselves in masculine tracks that only Okonkwo that Ezima permits and others if she's in aggressive mood. The same is of Okonkwo. Even though Okonkwo is fierce to everyone, it is only to Ezima that he shows his vulnerability, inequality, because he sees her as a man. She scolds him for not eating his meal when he is still traumatized for killing Ikemefune. You have not eaten for 2 days. She also understands the pride in valor, power, and conquering that feels in a man's heart like Okonkwo, because she thinks a masculine way within her culture. That is why she decided to persuade her sister to delay their respective marriages. So Okonkwo will use their marriages to gamble back into political power he lost due to going to exile. What is amazing from this analysis is that Ezima all along in Antebet text has been a non-binary in sexual identity or trans. It's because Ezima is a non-binary is why heterosexual marriage is not important to her. As Emeze says, it is important for an Ogbanje never to reproduce. In the Antebet text, Ezima is engaging in marriage because of her interest in political power such a contract can bring to her family. According to psychologist Sunday T.C. Eluchukwu, one of the characteristics of Ogbanje, according to Igbo healers, is women who exhibit masculine type behavior and repeatedly refuse marriage suitors. In heteronormative reading, they are classified as Ogbanje possessed by spirits who do not like men. However, in queer reading, they are non-binary, resisting the heterosexual union imposed by society on them through the instrumentality of being an Ogbanje. This positionality is what differs freshwater from things fall apart. I'm arguing here that due to the heteronormative reading of Ogbanje that dominates Antebet text, as well as Clark, Ogbanje has a different focus on its rebirth and the fear and trauma that comes with it. However, from queer positionality, the reading of Ogbanje, which Emeze's text for grants, has a different meaning and emphasis from Antebet. Because of this positionality, the concept of Ogbanje in freshwater showcases a tradition, non-binary in Igbo culture. Non-binary people in Igbo culture have used to subvert the suppressive system which won them into heterosexual union. It is through instrumentality of Ogbanje that some LGBT plus people in some African culture assert their sexual identity and freedom. I'll be summing this presentation by foregrounding at least two importance of this reading. On one hand, Coleman argues that the reason why LGBT people sociality and identity is opposed in many places in Africa is that the majority of Africans view homosexuality as Africa, unchristian, and unnatural. With this reading, it shows that trans or non-binary identities and sexuality is part of an African culture before the Western contact. Because Ogbanje Strakabiku, which is indigenous to some cultures, some African culture, is a queer concept. On the other hand, currently, dominant critics in Africa who often live in postcolonialism blame current homophobia in some places in Africa solely on colonialism. For instance, John C. Hawley posits that there is a long tradition of multiple sexuality in Africa, but it is a tradition that has been violently interrupted by Western colonialism. This paper rejects the idea that the West contact with these different cultures in Africa is made to take the sole blame for why queer people currently in Africa are being discriminated against due to colonial Christianity with its strong anti-gay stand. Because my reading shows that Ogbanje is a concept trans people employ to evade culture of oppression in places in Igbo culture before the Western contact. The colonial experiment contributed to the current attitude of oppression insofar as it's understood that it threatens a suppression already in place and helps to raise the true options or method of resistance employed by trans people priorly within these various cultures. Nuancing this narrative this way is essential. Firstly, it leaves the burden of attitudinal transformation to be carried out by Africans themselves and reduce blame culture, which diminishes responsibility. That is, nuancing it this way will secure a genuine transformation because it shows that various cultures within Africa need to do works in their cosmology to accept a reality denied. This will secure a true transformation for queer people and how they are currently being treated within the continent. To blame the colonial encounter is to postpone the necessary work needed to be done within African cosmology. I'm bringing this presentation to a close by revisiting the aim. I'm arguing that when African cultural production is only interpreted through the paradigm of postcolonialism, that we are leading various strategies of understanding African cultures and how it can contribute in shaping the world. It is for this reason, more than ever, that critics should ensure from using only a monolith paradigm of postcolonialism interpreting African literary production. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. It was great. Right, so it's time for questions. We have issues with the chat, so we're going to do kind of a raised hand scenario at the moment. So we've got hands raised already. Let's see. Okay, so we've got Leonie. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, please. Thank you both. That was great. Very interesting. Just what I needed of a Thursday evening. Hot fix of Global Gothic. I really enjoyed both papers. Obviously, I'm Leonie's PhD supervisor, so this is kind of that kind of question, I'm afraid. But it also relates to Peter's work, I think, on the Ogbanje, which as his PhD reviewer, I have encountered in more detail before and really found incredibly interesting. You both, it seems to me, talking about the in ways about the sort of cultural legacy of forms of colonialism, whether that be, you know, the Western colonial endeavour across Africa and indeed the rest of the world, or whether it be the kind of neo-colonialist inheritance of post-war de-Nipponisation and Americanisation and capitalisation. And I was particularly taken with the idea of permanence, which I don't think something you've really foregrounded much as yet, Leonie. And it got me thinking about concepts of, is it wabi-sabi? I don't know how it's pronounced, that kind of cornerstone of Buddhist thinking, which is a kind of cultural cornerstone in Japan. You know, which is all about impermanence, isn't it? And suffering and emptiness and all those good Buddhist things. So I guess my question is, you know, given that we're having a whole load of cultural mutation and destruction at the hands of Western capitalism, how might the Gothic enable us to chart any kind of route map out of that? Is the Gothic, can we be helped through the Gothic? Can these cultures so damaged by Western capitalism be healed by watching weird movies and reading strange texts?
Shall I go first, or would you like to, Teresa? Okay, I'm going to go ahead.
Yeah.
So there's so much here that I want to say. I think probably by virtue of you knowing the project, it's kind of the perfect question to open up a lot of different conversations. Firstly, with what you said about wabi-sabi, I'm really interested in the way that these sort of pseudo, sometimes genuinely, but often pseudo sort of Japanese ways of life exist over here, because these books that you see in the self-help section of Waterstones often aren't written by Japanese people at all. They're written by people from the West who are sort of westernizing Japanese ideas. And this is really interesting in terms of the neo-colonialism that you were talking about. So to anyone who I haven't talked to death about this, part of my project is to look at the way that disaster capitalism was implemented in Japan. So this is an idea that Naomi Klein, who is fantastic, talks about in her book, The Shock Doctrine, and she coined it to talk about sort of later 20th century politics, but it can be applied to Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well, because America came in after these two disasters, which of course they inflicted, and co-opted Japanese ways of life during the American occupation, and they overhauled the political system, the economic system, absolutely everything across the board. And then out of this, you have the growth of Japanese capitalism as we know it, which is kind of heralded on a global stage as being the most aggressive or aggressively accelerated form of capitalism that's ever really existed. Which I think is why it's so fertile for this kind of Gothic discourse. But when you take that, these obviously very real, potentially, you know, the biggest atrocity that's ever been inflicted by human beings onto other human beings. In more recent times, so the last few years, you had the same kind of language that is used to describe Hiroshima and Nagasaki being used to describe books like Marie Kondo, and she talks about obviously getting rid of a lot of your possessions, which again plays into these narratives of impermanence rather than permanence, so letting go of the material world. But the reason why I was looking over there when Leonie was talking is because up on my wall I have a quotation from a news article, and it talks about Marie Kondo causing a genocide of commodities because people are expelling them from their homes. And I just think it's so interesting that only a few generations after genuine genocide, which then the capitalist system grew out of, occurred, the same language is being used to talk about consumer culture in a very flippant manner. And so in terms of using the Gothic to sort of conceptualize a way through all of this, my fifth chapter, the final chapter of my project, is attempting to do this in some capacity. So it's looking at what commodity animism actually says about human beings and what it tells us about desire, because it is about human desire. This is why it's so effective as a marketing technique. And desire existed before capitalism, although capitalism would quite happily tell us that it didn't. So I think that interrogating desire to this extent in these ways, with all of these global discourses of neocolonialism and neoliberalism sort of clashing against each other and building into something quite unexpected, which is why I'm so attracted to cute capitalism, because how has that happened? I think that by looking at desire in these frameworks, it's a good way of potentially thinking about how desire could exist outside of capitalism again. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
With my research, what I presented is not what's political economy, but generally my research also look at how Gothic works in political economy and African culture. And one of the concepts I'm using to think of how Gothic would help us to come out from capitalist structure in terms of political economies. I'm using what David Garab or something what they call body economy, and is economy like in which a society that started with loan, because he was talking about how economy moved from loaning to currency. So in African culture, before the currency came, then it was there was so much dependence on loaning, which the people with power abused by which contributed to the reason why slavery in Western Africa was kind of succeeded in a way, because it tapped in the economy. It tapped out in an economy that was in a structure that was abused. So the implication in this now is that rich people, for instance, where I came from, there is this fear. People fear that the general say that they have blood money, and this blood money came for me. What I'm using more of film to interpret it is when the body economy was abused at the beginning, and then because when the body economy was abused during the time of slavery, then rich people we are seen as vampires that extracted people and sold them and used their money, literally and figuratively, to make their money. And this fear still exists in a lot of free writers that come from West Africa. Or if you watch a lot of Hollywood movies, you see rich people being depicted as they made their money from blood money. But it's a fear that is centuries ago that I'm interpreting as what started with when the body economy was firstly abused. So in terms of using Gothic now to map out to it, then in terms of how could, because still presently, figuratively, the money of the rich comes from extraction. So how could Gothic now help us to reposition the way the rich people, both figurative and literally, tap from people's body, people's blood to make their way. So this is part of my research in terms of Gothic in political economy. But the one I presented was just instead of Gothic towards sexual politics and identity. So it's different. You can't answer the question you asked. So that's why I didn't go to use it.
Great, thank you.
Right. We've got a question from Laura Moreau.
Hi, hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So thank you very much for the really fascinating presentations from both of you. I had a question for Leonie. I'm actually doing a PhD in Japanese Gothic as well, so it was really interesting for me to hear that. I was sort of interested in, so you talk about the animated inanimate, and I wondered if you'd kind of could trace it back at all to, I don't know if you know about the concept of tsukumogami, the animated tools or household objects that have acquired a spirit. I saw that you had Oiwa-san in one of your slides, so I figured you probably did. I wonder if that is that. Do you think it's maybe like a proto version of this, or is there? I'm intrigued to see what you think about if there is some kind of connection between these two things.
Thank you. That's such a fantastic question. And I would love to hear more about your project. So please do leave me your contact details. Yes, absolutely. It's certainly a prototype. And I was looking, it's the Peony Lantern, isn't it, the story? I'm not so good on pre-20th century Japanese Gothic, or whatever you want to call it. But absolutely, and also the traditions surrounding, like kami and yokai more generally as well. But part of what I'm going to be doing for my first chapter is tracking this back a bit further. At the moment, the furthest I've gone is Adagara Rampo in the 1920s. He wrote a story called The Human Chair. And this is sort of before, this is very interesting to me because it's kind of before the post-war eruption of Japanese capitalism. Obviously, capitalism had already been embedded in quite a different form. So absolutely, basically, you probably know much more about it than I do. But yeah, I would love to hear more about your project. Thank you.
We've got a question from Bronte now.
Hi, I actually have two separate questions for each speaker. Should I ask them one at a time, or should I do them both now? What do you prefer?
Probably doing one at a time.
Okay. Okay, I'll start with Leonie. I've read Leonie's whole paper, so I know what was cut from it, and she's got some great points. So I wanted to give her a chance to talk about the links between commodity animism and idol culture and how you see that expressed in Gothic terms, because I know you've done some fantastic work on that.
Thank you. So I'll try and keep this really brief. I'll just give a very, very quick summary. So idol culture is a section of the Japanese performance industry. And in very broad sense, it's young adolescent personalities that are marketed to embody the kind of tenets of cute capitalism. So it's young, very, very young girls, usually between the ages of 12 and 18, who then perform on stage to often male-dominated, predominantly like middle-aged audiences. And it's actually quite a complex relationship that occurs between them. It's often covered over here as sort of straight-up sexualization of very young girls, which it is to an extent. But the way that it's marketed is an escape or a return to childhood that is a sort of against the tenets of corporate culture. But of course, the idol industry is governed by exactly the same tenets, so it just reinforces the lifestyle that both sectors of society are kind of being thrust into. But the way that these young girls are marketed is very, very similar to commodity animism. So the images of their faces are printed onto products such as pencil cases and keychains and anything that you can think of. And then their fans are encouraged to build shrines to their favorite idols by bringing all of these products into their home. And the idea is that instead of imbuing the product with a life, it's projecting the life onto the product. So it's kind of like a less animated version of commodity animism, and the process that idols undergo when they become sort of implicated in this system of production. It's the same process, it's described in the same language that the life cycle of a Tamagotchi, which is a very conventional example of commodity animism, is described with. So the idols are referred to as an egg or a tamago, which is where Tamagotchi comes from. And I just think it's very, very interesting that the same language is used to describe young girls' animated objects and also food. It implicates them in this very strange, cute, capitalist sort of semantic field of consumption. And with the food thing, some of the products that the idols are projected onto are boiled sweets and desserts. So you can literally consume your favorite idol personality. And then Satoshi Kon has an amazing, amazing horror film called Perfect Blue, where this is experienced. Yes, so I'll leave it at that for now, but thank you for the question.
Thank you. So I didn't know about that's what Tamagotchi came from.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So my question for Peter is, I'm really interested in the way that kind of Gothic fiction in England kind of shaped theories of sexuality and gender and vice versa. And I'm wondering if you see that in African literature as well. Obviously, this is much broader, you know, comparing a tiny country to a huge continent. But do you see many examples of kind of Gothic or horror fiction influencing how people think about gender and sexuality, or ways of thinking about gender and sexuality informing kind of sources of horror? Are there many examples of that?
I think there is, and while we kind of don't see a lot of it, the way it's not that the text about it are not there, but the texts that are current for ground to be read in African literature comes from one paradigm, and which obviously we can trace in how the canonicity of African literature was formed from 1960s to say now, from 1960s, but through the influence of Congress of Cultural Freedom, which CIA sponsored, made sure that what we currently read as African literature become dominantly what is focused on one topic, being about colonial discourse. So your question, as I said, is not that like Freshwater, which I used to show at next time. It's kind of a text that shows that Gothic and Gothic concept can help in understanding sexuality and in gender politics in Africa. But while we don't see much of this text, as I said, is because the canonicity that was formed is a canonicity that makes sure that we don't see those texts. And there's a canonicity that only focuses on this discourse on colonialism and colonial discourse. So, for instance, as I gave one concept, many African countries, because African countries fill up a different cultures, but there's a lot of African cultures that have a similar Obanje concept, not just in Nigeria, but even in a lot of places in West Africa has this. Senegal, I think, has a similar Obanje concept. But and this Obanje concept, even though most of the reading we have been seeing about it is based on that reincarnation of torturing, but in itself is if not until I read Freshwater, I didn't know that the Obanje concept is a queer concept. I just recently saw that the potentiality of it as a queer concept, but because the focus is not on such issues, the focus is not so diverse. African cultural production is not so diverse as it's supposed to be because of 1960 cultural production vis-a-vis CIA and Congress of Cultural Freedom and what they made canonicity of African literature and cultural production to become. So with time, as researchers and as we keep breaking away from the shackles of postcolonialism, I think we will see more often of how different cultures have gender politics and how it is framing is the way as because African culture most often is culture of production. So obviously we find out that most of those concepts are framed in monotonous like in a way that we make people of LGBT people in the culture to have this monotonous concept of fear for just the way they frame their mind, but in another way it is a tool where people use to survey the culture. So what we see more of it with time as we get away from postcolonialism anyway. I don't know what I said made sense. I don't know, I'm talking rubbish anyway.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much.
Right. Are there any more questions at all?
Sorry. If there's no one on the chat right now who wants to ask a question, I have a question I want to ask if I could. Whilst all the people are thinking through beautiful answers. Thank you so much, both of you, for great papers. Both accounts. I do have a question for Leonie and Rowland. So, great conversation going with animism and all. And I wanted to ask you. So, looking now at this the idea of the material turn. And a lot of scholars work on new materialism, Barrett, Hawaii, and Limo. Is there for you a connection that you want to sort of emphasize between the idea of animism in Japanese culture and other ideas of the material turn? Is there something that sort of connects in this way, or?
So to be completely honest, I'm not that well versed in the material turn in general. But in terms of other sort of conceptions of materiality or a relationship towards the material world, I suppose what my project is interested in is the way that this is complicated across the board and what materiality actually means in the same way as what being human actually means. Has always been complicated, to be completely honest, because that's a term that can be like given or taken away depending on a whole host of factors. But in terms of the material world, I know that I have been meaning to look more into things like object-orientated ontology, where people are sort of in a slightly different way to commodity animism, foregrounding the material world as sort of, I suppose, a way of moving into a different kind of consciousness, a different kind of like de-anthropomorphizing the way that we view the world. And so that's very, very interesting to me, especially because commodity animism is doing the opposite, because it's a marketing technique. It's just concealing the human, but it's actually an aggressively human phenomenon. So in that sense, I think that it's doing something that is quite like vehemently against these other kinds of narratives. But I'm going to leave it at that for the moment because
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
If there's time, I have one question for Peter. I'm quite interested in the idea of moving beyond postcolonial theory and trying to find new ways to look at literatures and stuff in a particular culture area. What do you think is the reason why kind of scholarship seems not stuck, but kind of persistent in using the postcolonial model and theoretical framework to examine these texts? I know that's a very loaded question, so I apologize.
Yeah. Well, as I in answering when I was answering that question, I think if we want to really understand how postcolonialism came to dominance, we shouldn't just look at when the theoretical framework started, being the time of Eduasa, Said, and Baba, and stuff like that. No, we should go quite very back to the 1960s, and when African literary production, what we currently call African literary canon, was formed. And in this history, when that time was the time of post-war, and the time of post-war was the time of America wanting to be the world power, right? When British Empire was about to die or already dying, the American is taking over. So part of what America did during this time is to sponsor, part of wanting to take over the world power is in supporting art production, cultural production. So then the CIA then formed Congress of Cultural Freedom. So Congress of Cultural Freedom, CIA was at the back. No person knew CIA was at the back then, but later it was known. But before it was known, they have already done what they wanted to do. Congress of Cultural Freedom supported artists. It was, they didn't use by force. It was something that what we critic Shiga called politics of visibility. So what they did was there is writing and art that they want. So they supported those writers that write such art. So the writing they want is writing on colonial discourse. So the writing that talks about colonialism, and so then African literature specifically then supported only writing that talks about colonialism. Then I know first value, people would be like, oh, it's, by the way, colonialism is against the West, so they are like shooting themselves on the leg. But that is not true, because writing, the kind of writing they supported that finally materialized to what we call postcolonial theory, right? Is writing that interprets colonialism through the paradigm of modernity, through the paradigm of contesting modernity. For instance, if you're looking at Chukwunonso and Things Fall Apart, for instance, the dominant conflict in Things Fall Apart is about cultural confrontation. So I'm writing about cultural confrontation that the West came to Africa and Africa misunderstood the West, or the West misunderstood Africa because of different cultures. So there was cultural confrontation between these two cultures. So if you look at these literatures, it's literature that interpreted African literature through the focus of modernity. And then when we are talking about the issue of modernity, now we are leaving the main issue that brought colonialism, big capitalism. So by framing all this writing through the politics of representation, which what is postcolonial theory, being theory about politics of representation. For instance, now we're talking about diversity, blah blah blah. I'm not saying that diversity is not good. I'm saying that diversity, the way it is practiced, the way it is positioned, being through politics of representation, is beneficial to the elites, not to masses. Because if these elites that are being included, right, and the masses, a lot of masses being suppressed and being extracted, are not involved in this argument, right? So when we look at this, so shall form those arts that look at those issues of modernity, politics of representation that doesn't include the masses. And this is what African elite right? Because once we are talking about politics of representation, is to work in favor of them because they are the ones to be represented, right? But the masses, the poor masses won't get any benefit of this representation. So right now it is difficult for us to. It's difficult because the elites, postcolonialism favors elites, right? It favors elites. Is the language of elites. English language, for instance, which we use to discuss African literature, is the language of elites, right? So it doesn't bother them, right? What they are fighting is how to be represented, have to be incorporated in the power, right? So they can get their own part of the power. So for us to go to look at art that moves beyond postcolonialism is for allies to have allies that is against to work against themselves. They're ready to work against themselves, and they get the benefit they're gonna get from political representation. So it would be difficult because it would be like telling African allies to work against themselves. No, I don't know if what I say is making any sense. Sorry.
No, that was really interesting. These are things I never really considered before and knew the history behind, so thank you for that. I'm conscious of the time, so I want to have everyone join me to thank both our speakers, Peter and Leonie, for 2 wonderful papers. And